Hi, students. Let's take a look at some of the ideas here in Learning Guide 2.1, Introduction to Biodiversity. So I added in some images for you. For examples, genetic diversity. You can see that here we have all the same species of corn or maize, but the different colors represent different genetic diversity. And if there's genetic diversity that we're seeing on color, there's also going to be genetic diversity that's going to be affecting like its immune system. So its ability to fend off things like mold when it's growing in the field, or potentially viruses and things like that, parasites. So genetic diversity leads to stronger populations of that species because there's more variety. And so it's less likely to be wiped out by a single type of virus or a single type of fungus or something like that. Or change in weather conditions, there's more variety. There's a good chance that some of that corn varieties will be able to withstand the warmer, drier weather than others. So that at least as a species, it continues rather than just dying off. So genetic diversity helps to make the species more adaptable to changes in this environment. And species diversity is often what we might think of when we just say the word biodiversity, because this is just a number of different types of species in an environment. And generally speaking, the closer you get to the equator along the tropics, the more species diversity you have. Rainforests are at the equator, and they're known to have some of the highest species diversity on the planet. Other places that have a lot of species diversity is along coastlines because of the large amount of or large variation of habitat that occurs there. So habitat diversity is just a change in the abiotic factors. So going back to our aquatic biomes, intertidal areas have high habitat diversity because the conditions are sometimes like fully submerged underwater or partially submerged underwater, depending on how high you are along the shoreline. So there can be a lot of variation there in terms of how much air exposure versus water exposure as the tides go up and down. But here's a picture of a meadow. You got grass, you got forests, you got streams, or a stream. And with that, you have a lot of variation in the types of abiotic conditions. If you're a species that needs to build its home in the trees are there. If you need to be out in full sun, the sun is there. If you need to be near moisture, if it's, let's say you're a tree that has roots that need to tap into high levels of moisture, the creek bed is there. If you prefer to have like sort of a, I guess you could say dry sand, you have dry sand there as well. So when we have high habitat diversity, it leads to high species diversity. Okay, now I'll say one more thing about genetic diversity. Generally, this tends to increase as the population size gets better. So we can add that as well. Tends to increase as population sizes increase. Meaning the more organisms or individuals you have in that population, the greater the variation you're going to see in the individual traits of those organisms. Okay. Population bottleneck here. This is just a nice visual that shows that here you have a lot of genetic variation within a given species. But if there's some kind of a cataclysmic event that wipes out a large portion of that population, like maybe wipes out 90% of them, of the few organisms that survive, there's going to be less genetic variation within that population. So as they go on to reproduce after that, you're not going to have as much variety of genes because the variety of genes in the beginning population from the bottleneck is going to be smaller because it takes time for that variation to build up through mutations and things like that. Okay, for specialist species, a little example here of a koala who mostly feeds on eucalyptus. So that's a really good example of a specialist. He's very adapted to that. His body is very tuned into that. Whereas a generalist species like this raccoon can eat just about anything it can find. Its body has to have a little bit more, I guess you could say, flexibility built into it. So we'll learn a little bit later in the class about some of the advantages that specialists have over generalists, even though it seems like generalists kind of have it made because they can be less picky. And species richness, So we're just talking about the total number of species. So this is a measure of species diversity. Um, and one point about this is that when you have ecosystems where you have a large number of species, there's going to be a lot more connection between them in a food web. And that's going to make that ecosystem more resilient in the sense that you might lose one of those species or more, but because there's such a large number of possible predators out there, or possible prey, I mean, that it makes it easier for predators to switch to different food sources, assuming that they are generalist. So we tend to see ecosystems that have high levels of species richness being more stable. And species evenness. So this is the idea that of a given number of species, do you have a roughly equal number of them? Or is the community mostly dominated by one or a few species? And where this really comes into play is that if you have some of those populations that are really small and barely represented, if there's a natural disturbance, they might easily get wiped out. And so that's not going to lead to long-term stability of that community. Okay, so just going through some other ideas in this video here. Here we can see a visual of what I talked about. You know, perfect species evenness would be you have exactly the same number of each species. They're all equally represented. But it's more common. I mean, we never really see that in nature so precisely. This is just an example. Yes, so we discussed that difference there. Now going to this idea of net primary productivity and habitat diversity. So we tend to see greater habitat diversity in rainforests or in tropical areas in general. Well, I shouldn't say in general, but we see it in the rainforest for one, because you have a lot of vegetation there. And generally speaking, in areas where you have more vegetation, you're going to have more habitat diversity. Take the example of a rainforest. You have trees that are very tall. So there are species now that can hang out near the top where they might get more exposure to direct sunlight. You have species that might hang out at the bottom along the understory where they're protected from sun. There can be a lot of moisture, and there can be a lot of droppings from the trees too to help decompose and enrich the soil. So then you have all these other stories within what they call the canopy of the trees. So you can have some species that can live in the middle of the tree, so that they can easily go down to hunt and then back up to have their home to be protected. And so this is just one example of how rainforests can tend to have high habitat diversity. Swamps and marshes also have a lot of vegetation. And because swamps and marshes means that you have areas that are kind of wet. And so that means there can be a lot of variation between areas that are a little bit more dry and a little bit more wet. Some of the ones with the lowest habitat diversity is deserts. And just think, there's very little vegetation in deserts. And so vegetation equals habitat in most cases, unless it's just a cave that a lion's living in. But the lion isn't just staying in the cave, they're going out and hunting among the vegetation. So really, whenever you have an area with little vegetation, you're going to have very low habitat diversity. And we see things like shrubland, temperate grassland, savanna as a tropical grassland. These are kind of in the middle. They have a lot of grass. They don't have a lot of other large plants like we see in the forests. Okay, so maybe I can help you with this idea of how they're related, whether this makes sense. When we look at this next diagram here, we're seeing an example of genetic diversity. And I say that because we see lots of starfish, but we see that they're not all the same. I mean, these look like this one's a little bit orangish, this one's a little bit more brownish. It could be the lighting, but this one maybe also looks a little bit, slightly a little different. And it could be that these other ones, they might be the same species. And so when you have the same species, but variation in the genetics of it, then you have high genetic diversity. Because here you see purple ones, you see blue ones, you see the orange and brown. If they are different species, then we would not really be comparing their genetics. We would basically just look at variation of genetics within a given species. All right, so if we were to assume that all of these starfish that we see are the same species, which they probably aren't, but if we make that assumption, we can see that there's a lot of genetic diversity among those. And the reason we're focusing so much on the idea of species is that species can only reproduce with members of its same species. So there really is no mating occurring between starfish of different species. So it doesn't matter, their relative genetic diversity because they're separate. Okay, now, but relating to abiotic conditions, as conditions change, species have to be able to adapt to those changing conditions. And so the way that some habitats can change is they can become warmer, they can become saltier, their pH, they can become more acidic or more basic. And if you have a large genetic diversity, you're going to have some individuals within that population who are going to be able to adapt to those different conditions. I shouldn't say that the species adapt. You have some species that will be able to survive in those changing conditions. And as they then reproduce more effectively, the species will over time adapt to those new conditions through each generation. Okay. So in this diagram here, a couple of key points here to point out. We've already been talking about the more genetic diversity there is, the better it can respond to environmental stressors, like we just talked about. And loss of habitat is going to affect specialists more than generalists, because generalists can leave and they can find other comparable food sources that are good enough for them in other areas. But if a specialist needs to eat a certain type of plant, and if that plant is being cut down by habitat loss, then that species is going to suffer. Their populations are going to decline because of not getting enough food. And ecosystems with a large number of species are more likely to recover from disruptions. So that's kind of what we talked about. The greater number of species, that means there's more species that are available to repopulate, for example, an area that may have gotten wiped out by a fire or any kind of disturbance. It could be a tornado, volcanic eruption, covering up vegetation with ash. Okay, now this is just one other example that going back to this idea of generalists versus specialists, we do see sea levels changing, we see them rising. So this is an environmental change happening on coastlines all around the world. And the species that are more generalists, they're going to be able to survive better in those areas that are now experiencing that change. So, we talk about tides. As you go further up the coast towards the mainland, you are not going to be underwater as much. But as sea levels are rising, more of that coastal area is going to be underwater more times of the day. So you have to have species that are able to tolerate this new condition that they're experiencing. And generalists who aren't as picky about how much time they spend underwater, they are going to be able to survive better. And the specialists will tend to die off in those changing conditions. This is a different way of illustrating generalist versus specialist. And here we're just using blue to represent the range of types of food that they can eat. And specialists, like this panda, primarily relies on bamboo. So they're able to use a much more restricted type of resource for food. And so that's the main distinction here between generalists versus specialists. So we'll learn more about those differences in the future. And lastly, we talk about here factors that can increase genetic biodiversity. I added some reasoning in here that you can take a look at. The main idea here is that when you have environmental conditions that are more stable or less varying, it means that the populations are going to be able to grow more fully to their, I guess you could use the word, to their carrying capacity. And that's a word we'll learn later on, but it allows the populations to get bigger without being cut down or chopped or affected by disturbances. And the bigger the population, the greater the genetic diversity. And as far as evolution over time, creates that biodiversity as we spoke about, but that takes a long time. And that's why we want to try to not lose too much of species populations because we lose that genetic variation. That takes a long time to recover. But this idea of that minor disturbances like surface fires, wind, storms, and floods, they can increase the habitat diversity. When there's a fire that comes through, that's going to bring down a lot of vegetation. It's going to allow more sunlight to come through. So now you have the areas that were unaffected by the fire still experiencing a lot of shade or blockage from wind. And now you have this opened up area with sunlight, with wind, and that can increase the species diversity because it's increasing the habitat diversity. And high habitat diversity leads to more genetic diversity, just from the idea that some like it hot, some like it not. Each individual of each species is its own individual. It has its own genetic blueprint. And just like, unless you're an identical twin, there's no one else in the world, no other human that has the same genes as you. And so those genes also indicate our preferences, like how warm we'd like to be, what kind of environment we like to be in, whether we like being in the sun for a lot of time or not very much time, things like that. So the more habitat diversity, the more we can please all the individuals within a population. I didn't get around to filling in this part here, but this is sort of like the opposite of a lot of things we looked at. Extinction is the opposite of evolution. Continuous environmental stress, that means a lot of populations are being killed off or are losing a majority of their population size from things like climate change or the mega fires that we've been experiencing lately, and in California at least. So we talked about those are the extreme disturbances, or crown fires as sometimes they're called, because they burn so violently. Geographic isolation, we'll be seeing some more of that as sea levels rise. Some areas that are currently connected by land will be cut off. And because of that, populations are going to get sort of sequestered or stuck on smaller islands. And those populations are not going to be able to breed with other populations of the same species as easily. And so because of that, there's not going to be as much mixing of genes. And of course, invasive species, they're going to be disrupting that species evenness. They might not be killing off or out competing many other species, but they're going to be, when I say out competing, they might drastically reduce the number of those other species without necessarily making them go all the way away. So I hope this was helpful for you. And again, as always, feel free to ask questions, email, in class, in the chat, or pop in during office hours. Thank you very much for tuning in.